Greetings and Happy New Year. I'm your host, Dr. Wolfula, and when I'm not counting down the new year with the Count himself, I'm here at the Wolfula reviewing movies. In this video, I'll be reviewing Nosferatu. No, not that one. Not that one either. Definitely not that one. Okay, the new one directed by Robert Eggers. Yeah, that one. From the director of The Witch and The Lighthouse, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu has been a decade in the making and highly anticipated. For good reason. It's a remake of one of the first major horror movies. Definitely one of the most influential films of all time, with this remake being crafted by a well-regarded auteur, and this Nosferatu remake is one of the last big movies to close out 2024. This movie was probably the last theatrical experience of 2024 for many of its viewers. All of this comes with some pretty big expectations, and while Nosferatu might not live up to the insane expectations placed on it, I do think it's pretty damn good. But before I move on to my review, I feel like I should give some context with a bit of the history of Nosferatu on film, if you're only familiar with it from an episode of SpongeBob.
I don't think we need the writer any longer.
Skip to this time code if you want to just get straight to the actual review of the new Nosferatu. The original Nosferatu, Old Romanian for Insufferable One, was a silent German production released in 1922 and directed by F.W. Murnau. His name short for I.F.W. Murnau, F.R.F.R. Nosferatu is the earliest surviving vampire film. There was an earlier film titled The Vampire, but ironically, it didn't actually have vampires in it. And there was an earlier Hungarian adaptation of the novel Dracula titled Dracula's Death, but that movie is unfortunately lost. Nosferatu itself is an unauthorized loose adaptation of Dracula that nearly could have been lost as well. When Bram Stoker's widow heard of Nosferatu, without even seeing the film, she won a lawsuit that resulted in her ordering that every copy of Nosferatu be destroyed instead of, like, I don't know, just making money off the movie herself. Unlike most movies from the silent era, though, Nosferatu managed to survive. You know a movie is wanted for destruction, you're gonna make sure you're holding on to some copies of it until things blow over. Like I said, Nosferatu is a loose Dracula adaptation, but really, the only major differences are the change of setting from late 19th century Britain to early 19th century Germany, changing the names of all the characters and altering the title villain, Count Orlok, or Nosferatu, and his ultimate fate. Nosferatu, for the most part, follows Dracula's initial plot closely. A real estate agent, in this case Thomas Hutter, is tasked with closing a deal with a Transylvanian count who turns out to be a vampire, and this count takes a ship to his new home where he terrorizes the populace. The main difference here is in the handling of the Count himself. Count Orlok, played by Max Schreck, no relation to the ogre, is far less human compared to the Dracula of the novel and conventional adaptations. Orlok is a total freak with a rodent-like appearance down to bearing buck-tooth fangs. Orlok is way too outwardly creepy to infiltrate society like the charismatic Dracula could. Dracula was also a warlord who returned from death as a vampire, whereas Orlok is implied to be a practitioner of black magic who was turned into a vampire by the archdemon Belial. The original Nosferatu focuses more on making the Dracula material terrifying to audiences at the time. Bram Stoker's Dracula was a contemporary novel. Now it's an old book, of course, but at the time it told the story of an ancient vampire infiltrating modern society. The film Nosferatu places itself further back in time, though, and frames its story around a mysterious plague that almost wiped a town out, exploring the true cause of this plague. This approach to the narrative gives it this greater sense of authenticity, like it really happened, making the story scarier and building up intrigue surrounding the events. Vampires, like Dracula, are typically treated like parasites that live in a society, draining life from within it literally, while creating a support system of other vampires. But Count Orlok is treated more as a pure personification of death. When he moves into the town, he brings with him a legion of plague rats to distract from his arrival and act as a red herring for the deaths he himself causes. Orlok doesn't create other vampires, he only kills. Orlok's crazed servant Nock, the Renfield analog, is merely another distraction from Orlok himself. Orlok is on another level as a vampire, this larger-than-life, seemingly unstoppable threat, depicted through iconic imagery as pure darkness, and ultimately Orlok is undone by pure light, both literally and figuratively. Thomas Hutter's wife, Ellen, a woman of pure heart, ultimately sacrifices herself to Orlok, and her blood is apparently so good it causes him to lose track of the time and become incinerated by the sunlight, an idea introduced by Nosferatu. Before, vampires were merely weakened by the sun. Now most vampires die to it like Orlok, or sparkle in it, I guess. Nosferatu is one of the most influential vampire films, possibly more influential than the later Bela Lugosi take, and consequently, that means Nosferatu has had a huge influence on vampire media and horror at large since its release, but it also has had some more direct descendants leading up to the most recent remake. In 1979, Werner Herzog notably remade Nosferatu as Nosferatu the Vampire, with Klaus Kinski, the second worst German citizen in history, in the title role.
So you allow me to see to your comfort?
Herzog shot his remake as soon as Dracula entered the public domain, meaning that he could use the names from the original novel.
Count Dracula, he wants to buy a house here.
Using Count Dracula instead of Count Orlok, Jonathan Harker instead of Thomas Hutter, Van Helsing instead of Bueller, or Lucy instead of Ellen as examples. But the Herzog remake is otherwise a faithful remake of the original Nosferatu. But with Kinski playing a sadder, more pathetic version of the Count that is creepy, but not as much of an imposing, scary threat, and he kinda looks like Uncle Fester.
The children of the night make their music.
The 1979 remake is beautifully shot, a work of art, but it feels kind of dull, amping up erotic elements in favor of the actual horror, and it has a bizarre, goofy twist ending that's a departure from the original film, where the Count seems to only be momentarily stunned by sunlight, leaving Van Helsing to impale the Count with a stake, but the twist is that Harker has become a vampire, and through a really awkward exchange...
And take the man to prison. Go on, get on with it.
I can't, I'm unarmed.
Nevertheless, you'll arrest this man.
Harker has Van Helsing arrested for the murder of Count Dracula, allowing Harker to live happily ever after as a vampire that isn't hurt by sunlight. I don't know. Herzog's remake is good, I just couldn't get into it like the original.
Meet Count Orlok.
Another more recent take on Nosferatu that ties directly into the new remake is 2000's Shadow of the Vampire, starring Willem Dafoe as the lead vampire, who's also in the new Nosferatu as the Count's nemesis this time.
Don't look at me that way.
Shadow of the Vampire tells a fictionalized account of the making of the original Nosferatu, where the original film's director, F.W. Murnau, played by John Malkovich, hires a real vampire to play Orlok, masquerading as a method actor named Max Schreck in an attempt to make a realistic vampire film. With Dafoe's Schreck feeding on the cast and crew over the course of the film. There's a sense of humor to Dafoe's vampire, where he's a total diva making unreasonable demands of Malkovich.
You will have no close-ups, none whatsoever.
But there's also a sadness to Dafoe's portrayal of an aging vampire in decline, who's all alone in this world, unable to make other vampires. But there's still a scariness to this vampire where his true name is never revealed, his ancient origins are vague, and how desperate he's become in modern times to cooperate with the director for a film, while the vampire constantly breaks his agreement with Murnau out of pure desperation to feed.
This is hardly your picture any longer.
Shadow of the Vampire is a fun, wonderful take on Nosferatu and features one of Willem Dafoe's best performances, but it also further confirms that I've never seen Cary Elwes act good in anything.
What I should have done was film the thing in slow motion. It would have been incredibly moving.
There was another more low-budget Nosferatu remake released the same day as the big-budget remake and starring Doug Jones as Count Orlok. That was funded through Kickstarter way back in 2014. This indie Nosferatu remake is a faithful shot-for-shot remake, but I probably won't see this remake. It looks too digital, too artificial, and I'd rather see something that tries to reinvent the original material. Something like the Robert Eggers remake of Nosferatu. But before I move on to my review of that Nosferatu remake, I just want to give a shout out to my sponsor, me! Pledge to my Patreon today to support the channel, help it continue to grow, and you'll also get access to weekly movie nights every Sunday, and archive commentaries if you miss the movie nights live. Just $5 a month to get a movie night every week. Here are the movies I'll be streaming next Sunday. Pledge to patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula if you're interested in my bonus streams, and I thank you in advance.
The vampire, Nosferatu.
Now, the Robert Eggers Nosferatu remake has been greatly anticipated, but I wasn't really paying attention to it before finally seeing it on Christmas Day. I didn't even watch a trailer, I went in blind, and I was surprised to find that this remake is surprisingly faithful to the original film. I was expecting it to be more of an homage remake of Nosferatu like the Suspiria remake, where it's just an unrelated vampire movie with a familiar title, or a more faithful adaptation of Dracula. But no, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu follows the original 1922 film's version of the Dracula narrative very closely, down to the early 19th century German setting, and most of Nosferatu's versions of the character names are left intact. The only major difference in that department is Willem Dafoe's version of Van Helsing is named Franz instead of Bueller.
We must first face that it exists.
This new Nosferatu basically reimagines certain aspects of the original film's narrative, making the material darker, more violent, more sexually explicit, while expanding on characters and situations that were left vague in the silent film, with the main difference being that the female lead of the story is given a larger role.
But I'd never been so happy.
If you're familiar with any version of the story of Dracula, this Nosferatu hits all the familiar narrative beats. A real estate agent, Thomas Hutter, played by Nicholas Hoult, is tasked with closing a deal with a Transylvanian count named Orlok, with Hutter forced to leave his wife Ellen, played by Lily Rose Depp, behind with Hutter's friend Friedrich, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson. Hutter finds that the locals in Transylvania are terrified of Count Orlok, played by Bill Skarsgård, bouncing back after being in one of 2024's biggest flops. And when Hutter meets with the Count himself, Thomas understands why everybody's so spooked by Orlok, and Hutter tries to race back home as the Count makes his way to Hutter's hometown to terrorize the community and prey on Hutter's wife Ellen. In keeping with the original Nosferatu's take on the material, Orlok is accompanied by a legion of plague rats.
The undead plague carrier.
Oh, and you might think that this Nosferatu remake coming out on Christmas Day was just a weird gimmick, but no! This version of Nosferatu actually takes place on Christmas, but it's only because Chris Columbus is one of the producers. It's in his contract that any movie he writes, directs, or produces has to have at least one scene on Christmas.
Happy Christmas, Harry. Happy Christmas, Ron.
The biggest departure from the original Nosferatu with this remake, though, is the handling of Ellen.
But you could never please me as he could.
Though thankfully she's still not as terrifying as the talk show host she shares her name with. In the original film, Ellen was a pretty typical silent film heroine, pure of heart, faithful to her husband, with visions of potential doom, and Orlok just happens to become fixated on Ellen. Pretty straightforward. The new film makes Ellen much more of a complex, ambiguous, and even creepy figure, but thankfully not as creepy as the talk show host she shares her name with, since Ellen in this film is ultimately still a victim. Much like her co-star Aaron Taylor Johnson, Ellen is the victim of grooming by a blood-sucking vampire. As a young girl, Ellen in her loneliness inadvertently makes some kind of telekinetic contact with Count Orlok, like some kind of vampire version of Discord.
Come to me.
And Orlok ends up assaulting the young Ellen. Orlok's move to Germany years later is essentially a long con to get closer to Ellen, having tricked Thomas into signing divorce papers to goad Ellen into becoming Orlok's eternal companion. The Orlok/Ellen relationship is expanded into more of a twisted Beauty and the Beast, King Kong anti-love story. It makes the narrative more robust and gives Ellen more of a role in the story when Thomas is off on his own journey.
I'm ready.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
In the original film, Ellen is just kind of worried while Thomas is away. In the new film, the uncertainty surrounding Thomas's absence causes Ellen to gradually unravel and allow Orlok's dark influence to possess Ellen's mind. It does become a bit of a possession movie like The Exorcist, but it's kind of interesting to see that handled in a 19th century context when people had a very limited handle on science and really believed in demons and shit.
Its desire is to consume all life on Earth.
Bill Skarsgård's Count Orlok was a pretty big surprise from this new Nosferatu. I had heard Skarsgård was in the movie, but I didn't know who he was playing, and I wasn't totally sure it was even Bill Skarsgård playing the Count. It's a total transformation transformation that goes further than Skarsgård's portrayal of Pennywise. Initially and inventively, Orlok is presented as a figure of pure shadow when he communes with Ellen, but I was kind of surprised and somewhat disappointed as a purist by Orlok's actual design in the film. It's more of a fusion of Dracula's mustachioed look in the Bram Stoker novel and the more freakish characteristics of Count Orlok. He looks a bit like Tony Clifton. I can understand why they decided to revamp the original movie Vamp for this remake, though. The classic Orlok look has become a vampire cliche, and it's associated now with SpongeBob, so can be hard to take seriously. This new movie's take on Orlok is made more haggard, yet imposing as a physical threat, as opposed to the more sinister and ghoulish Max Schreck original. The new remake focuses on just making Orlok repulsive and monstrous. When Orlok sucks blood, it sounds like an old man struggling to eat soup. Orlok has a thick Eastern European accent, but it sounds just as haggard as he is. An intentionally unsexy, warped take on Bela Lugosi's accent.
Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make.
They don't even have Orlok put on the typical Dracula facade of cordiality. He's fucking rude and shitty to Thomas from the get-go, but Thomas is just too afraid of Orlok to do anything about it. Skarsgård's Orlok is a very intimidating presence, but there's this sort of sad, desperate loneliness behind it all that makes me realize that Orlok is really just what Dracula would be if he was an incel and didn't have vampire brides and shit. It does make this Orlok feel more human than most Dracula portrayals, despite how inhuman he looks. And unlike Dracula, Count Orlok in this movie hangs dong.
Dude hangs dong.
The actor who unfortunately doesn't hang dong in this movie is Willem Dafoe as Professor Albin von Franz. Dafoe's character is a reimagining of the Professor Bueller character from the original Nosferatu, the Van Helsing surrogate, fused now with traits belonging to the producer of the original Nosferatu, Albin Grau, the man who initiated making Nosferatu through his obsession with the occult. Dafoe's Professor von Franz is turned into more of an expert on the occult consequently, turning his back on more rational sciences in pursuit of some greater truths in the universe. Dafoe brings with him a striking, charismatic performance as always.
This creature is a force more powerful than evil.
Delivering hypnotic monologues on the supernatural, but it does feel like he's a little too limited to being an exposition dump. A Dr. Loomis figure whose purpose is just to hype up Count Orlok's evil and power, and it works, but there isn't some satisfying confrontation between this film's version of Van Helsing and Dracula. They don't really meet, and it sort of draws some attention to the weaknesses of being so faithful to this version of the Dracula story. Nosferatu's story works really well as a telling of the Dracula tale within the constraints of a silent film told purely through visuals and sparse intertitles. It streamlines the Dracula narrative and simplifies it into more of a fairy tale by turning the Count into more of a freak lurking in the shadows as a plague bringer. You get rid of a lot of the wordier aspects of the story where Dracula tries to infiltrate society. The new remake keeps the plague aspect of Orlok's arrival, which makes Orlok's version of a vampire story feel like it's on a biblical level, and also relevant with the recent pandemic, but because it's such a faithful adaptation of a silent film, the new remake can feel fairly limited for a modern movie.
The stench of their bodies was horrible.
It feels like it could have been more of a tale told on an epic scale where the town is expanded upon and we get some time with Orlok terrorizing the general populace and see the community comprehensively collapse, but the remake is limited to 6 characters besides Orlok and his minion Nock, like the original movie, and Orlok doesn't get a lot of scenes interacting with the characters once he's in town, which keeps Orlok mysterious and scary when he does show up, but it just feels like something's missing. It can almost feel like a Scooby-Doo mystery at times. Count Orlok's on the loose in the old Crips gang. We gotta split up and solve this case.
He is coming.
Aaron Taylor Johnson's Friedrich is expanded upon in the remake, given a very tragic narrative that does raise the stakes and make you want to see Orlok on a stake, but it feels like Orlok could have done more to try to sabotage the plans of those seeking to stop him, attacking Thomas and von Franz at some point, but they just aren't on Orlok's radar at all. It makes them feel a little irrelevant. I enjoyed the movie a lot. It just felt like action was being withheld that could have easily taken place, especially since, as a faithful adaptation of the original Nosferatu, it has more of an emotional climax as opposed to a satisfying climactic confrontation involving the various characters. And believe me when I say this, there's certainly another kind of climax during the film's ending. Ultimately, Nosferatu is a beautiful gothic nightmare brimming with atmosphere and told through wonderfully creepy abstract visuals. The remake faithfully recreates the original film story while expanding on it and pushing the boundaries beyond what could be shown in the 1920s, making it disturbing to a modern audience through more graphic violence and more explicit sexuality, taking the usual romantic approach to a vampire story and warping it into something more grotesquely erotic, with some of that random artsy modern nudity thrown in. Like there's a scene where some gypsies got a naked virgin girl riding a horse through the woods, but for a virgin, she had some pretty big knockers. Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is honestly what I want to see from remakes of these classic horror movies from the 20s and 30s. Faithful adaptations that take place in the eras they were first told in, but with modern production values and reimagined and expanded narratives that make these classic stories scary to contemporary viewers. It really can work. I just wish this new Nosferatu expanded on its own narrative a little more. I give Robert Eggers' Nosferatu an Orlok hanging dong out of Willem Dafoe hanging dong. What the? Hey, Goulash, quit flickering the lights. Hey, I'm not doing it. Well, if you aren't doing it, then who is? Nosferatu. This video is made possible through the pledges of my Patreon supporters, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to the kind folks pledged to my shoutouts tier. All of the support on Patreon means a lot to me, and it helps my dark influence continue to grow. If you like this video, like it, and if you loved it, click the subscribe and bell buttons for more vids. Be sure to also keep in touch by following me on social media at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Dr. Wolfula. While I still have your attention, consider pledging to my Patreon to support the channel and get bonus content like previews, VIP Discord server access, private movie night streams, and credits in videos. Consider pledging at patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula. Also, check out official Dr. Wolfula t-shirts and other merch on tpublic.com/user/Dr. Wolfula. Thanks for watching. See you all next time. Dr. Wolfula signing out.